Okay, so I'm going to do a review on the Middle Ages, and the big question is, were the Middle Ages a period of chaos and disorder or a period of vitality and achievement? So the first question is, what effect did the fall of Rome have on Western Europe? So the fall of Rome made Europe, there was a lot of chaos and there was no stable government and no order, no military, and a bunch of civil wars, and no ruralization or education. Also, there was more poverty. Um, the next question is, how did Charlemagne's reign impact Western Europe? So, Charlemagne was the first emperor to reunite Europe since the Roman Empire, and he reigned from 768 to 843. He conquered new lands, and so when he died, there was a Treaty of Verdun, and that was in 843, and it divided the empire um, to his relatives, and he, during his reign and the next reign, the popes became very powerful, and the political they were political and religious leaders, and they controlled who could be emperor or king, and the popes limited the authority of nobles, and no, not the popes, the Charlemagne limited the authority of nobles because he regularly visited every part of the kingdom. And then in 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne the emperor, which was a big deal because the pope was crowning a king or emperor. Um, Charlemagne also promoted education. He ordered monasteries to open schools to train future monks and priests, and he made a big deal of record keeping. Even though a lot of people were illiterate, he made the people who were literate make handwritten copies of Latin books to have accurate records and information. So he promoted education. Um, so the next question is, how did the feudal and manorial system provide for the needs of people in the Middle Ages? And so first I'm going to define feudalism. So feudalism was a system of governing and landholding that is based on land for loyalty. So if you're loyal to the king, then you'll get land, which was called a fief. And the king has the power to get rid of a fief for any person. So the king has power over a fief and controlled the land. So the nobles were the people who pledged their loyalty to the king for the fief, and they were the landowners who happened to be wealthy. And so kind of the social class. So so the people equal to the nobles were the church officials, and they were like the bishops and the cardinals. They were like the high-ranking church power besides the pope. And then there were the knights, and the knights were just the warriors who pledged to defend lords in exchange for the fiefs again. So they worked for the nobles, and the nobles could grant fiefs to knights as well. So the kings granted fiefs to the nobles, and the nobles granted fiefs to the knights. So the nobles and the nobles, church officials, and knights were all part of the vassal class, and they're all like, it's kind of classified like they're all loyal to somebody above them besides the king. So what's left over is the serfs, and the serfs were 90% of the population. So they just worked all day in the fields, and they couldn't leave. They were bound to their land, so they couldn't leave the place they were born. So they were basically kind of similar to like slaves, but not exactly. They were just like part of the property owned by the nobles. So they were like kind of property because they were forced to work there. And the vassal class, what I talked about before, the nobles, church officials, and knights, they controlled all of the wealth, but that was 10% of the population. So that kind of that kind of like presented a conflict between, because there was no middle class. It was like 90% of people were wealthy and then 10% of people were poor, and that like was a problem. So the next question was, what were the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church? So there were a bunch of beliefs. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Pope. So the Pope, they believe that the Pope was a spokesperson for God on earth, and he was the leader of the papal states, and also about the Pope, what I also talked about this before, that the Pope had the right to pick the king. So Catholics in general, like their like greed is very like frowned upon, and a quote is like people like, not a quote, but so people in a class should be content with where they are, because they thought it was like faith from God. And then like, so like within the classes there's equality, but then in between classes there's inequality. So like it's like it's not, it's like okay that one class is wealthier, better than another. um so and they believed that the Pope rules the souls and the king rules the bodies, and the king follows the Pope's demands. And and they believed that the church could excommunicate someone, and that would mean that they would be denied their salvation, which means that it's telling someone that they can't go to heaven. So canon law was like a law of the church, and you had to adhere to the teachings of the church or you'd be excommunicated. And that's what I just talked about. So the Bible was the holy book that contained the whole Old and New Testament, so you had to worship the Bible, um, and follow the sacraments, which were pathways to heaven, which were just like 7 things that you had to do: be baptized, confess, go to communion, confirm your belief, be married, holy orders, and anointing of the sick. And those were just some of the sacraments. And also there was the 10 Commandments, which Jews have as well, which is the guidelines for living. And a big thing is Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God, and to worship Jesus because he is the head person. So yeah. So the next question is, what role did the Roman Catholic Church play during the Middle Ages? So the Roman Catholic Church had spiritual and political power. So it brought people closer together and gave them a sense of identity, and it was a stable force that survived through the Roman Empire. So it gave people a sense of security and community, which was good during like the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages, where like things were falling apart and there was chaos. So the clergy was the Pope, then the cardinals, then the bishops, and the priests. So the Pope, cardinals, and bishops controlled a lot of the church power, but while the less powerful priests and monks spent time with like common people. So there was church justice, like I talked about before, like canon law, which like concerned marriage and religious practices. So people, like a main reason people follow the church is because they, like the Pope and people, it's all about salvation. Like if they follow the church, they would go to heaven. So also the church was a center of learning, and the monks were very educated, and they set up universities and schools, and they like preserved Greek and Roman Arabic texts. So they acquired a lot of information, and but there was like limited access to the information, so only the church officials could read and write, and the common man couldn't. So although there was good education, it wasn't for everybody. Also, the church held, so the church held all the knowledge. So that contributed to making the church very powerful, because they controlled education, not anyone else. Um, so the next question is, what conflicts emerged between the church and secular kings? So the Pope and the King, there was like a constant like battle between them, and like they both believed that they should have more power over the other. But in terms of Christianity, like so but like overall at the end of the day the Pope kind of won. So like so the Pope believed everything had to go through him, and the King believed he had the right to oversee church affairs. So the kings believed they had the right to appoint bishops. So the king so the king passed the lay investiture law, which allowed him to appoint bishops, but the Pope Gregory prohibits lay investiture, and King Henry refused to follow Pope's orders and becomes excommunicated. So like this just proves the power of the church, how they were able to just like excommunicate someone until they had to like beg for forgiveness. So and then the whole conflict was resolved by a compromise known as the Concordat of Worms in 1122. So the next question is, why did Pope Urban II call for a crusade? So during this time, the Seljuk Turks were threatening the Byzantines. And in 1093, the Byzantine emperor asked the Pope in Rome for help. And in 1095, the council called for a crusade to recapture Jerusalem. So they declared that in order to help the Byzantines, they had to recapture Jerusalem. So the first crusade was actually successful, and they captured Jerusalem, but it was accompanied by looting and massacre. So when they finally got to Jerusalem, it was occupied by Muslims and Jews, and Christians slaughtered people, and that kind of like defined the first crusade. So the Crusaders thought they were going to Jerusalem to like express their Christian views, but the acts they did when they got there were not really just, and it wasn't really very Christian, and they killed people and just a lot of stuff like that. So the second crusade, they failed to capture like cities and other major cities besides Jerusalem that they were interested in getting, and um, and the Muslim leader Saladin was sieged Jerusalem from them. So the Crusaders were murderers to the Muslim point of view, but in the Christian point of view, they were like acting on behalf of God, which was a whole other conflict, and it kind of just started the conflict between the Muslims and the Christians in general. So the third crusade was unsuccessful, and they failed to recapture Jerusalem because they lost it from the Muslims. The fourth crusade diverted from Jerusalem from its Venetian financial backers to sack and divide Constantinople. So this was about Constantinople, like a holy city where Jesus was fighting, and they wanted that, and it was disputed, and the Christians were killing other Christians. Like, so this was different from the first crusade because that was about religion, but now it's this crusade, the third crusade, is kind of more about money because they wanted Constantinople for other reasons, and it was just becoming like it kind of just dragged out, and it was the motives kind of changed. So then there was the Children's Crusade, and the Children's Crusade was when thousands of children crossed Europe to get to Palestine. So, but many died, and it wasn't successful, and they were captured as slaves, and that was not good. The Fifth Crusade was they captured a city in Egypt, but it was unsuccessful. And the Sixth Crusade, Jerusalem was almost bought by the Egyptians. Okay. The Seventh Crusade and Eighth Crusade were just not successful, and Then eventually it was the end of crusading and Christianity invasions in the Middle